Hello, online pipe community. Ethan, Parsimonious Piper, and I am once again here with,
Potted Piper.
and we are going to dive right into the very next of C.S. Lewis Screwtape letters. I think we're up to 27 now. Let's see here. Yes, sir. 27. And it's my turn to read, so I'll dive right in. My dear Wormwood, you seem to be doing very little good at present. The use of his love to distract his mind from the enemy is, of course, obvious, but you reveal what poor use you are making of it when you say that the whole question of distraction and the wandering mind has now become one of the chief subjects of his prayers. That means you have largely failed. When this or any other distraction crosses his mind, you ought to encourage him to thrust it away by sheer willpower and to try to continue the normal prayer as if nothing had happened. Once he accepts the distraction as his present problem and lays that before the enemy and makes it the main theme of his prayers and his endeavors, then so far from doing good, you have done harm. Anything, even a sin, which has the total effect of moving him close up to the enemy, makes against us in the long run. A promising line is the following. Now that he is in love, a new idea of earthly happiness has arisen in his mind, and hence a new urgency in his purely petitionary prayers about this war and other such matters. Now is the time for raising intellectual difficulties about prayer of that sort. False spirituality is always to be encouraged. On the seemingly pious ground that praise and communion with God are the true prayer, humans can often be lured into direct disobedience to the enemy, who, in his usual flat, commonplace, uninteresting way, has definitely told them to pray for their daily bread and the recovery of their sick. You will, of course, conceal from him the fact that the prayer for daily bread, interpreted in a spiritual sense, is really just as crudely petitionary as it is in any other sense. But since your patient has contracted the terrible habit of obedience, he will probably continue such crude prayers, whatever you do. But you can worry him with the haunting suspicion that the practice is absurd and can have no objective result. Don't forget to use the heads I win, tails you lose argument. If the thing he prays for doesn't happen, then that is one more proof that petitionary prayers don't work. If it does happen, he will, of course, be able to see some of the physical causes which led up to it, and therefore it would have happened anyway, and thus a granted prayer becomes just as good a proof as did not a. Let me back up too, but since your patient has contracted the terrible habit of obedience, he will probably continue such crude prayers, whatever you do. But you can worry him with the haunting suspicion that the practice is absurd and can have no objective result. Don't forget to use the heads I win, tails you lose argument. If the thing he prays for doesn't happen, then that is one more proof that petitionary prayers don't work. If it does happen, he will, of course, be able to see some of the physical causes which led up to it, and therefore it would have happened anyway. And thus, a granted prayer becomes just as good a proof as a denied one that prayers are ineffective. You, being a spirit, will find it difficult to understand how he gets into this confusion. But you must remember that he takes time for an ultimate reality. He supposes that the enemy, like himself, sees some things as present, remembers others as past, and anticipates others as future. Or, even if he believes that the enemy does not see things that way, yet, in his heart of hearts, he regards this as a peculiarity of the enemy's mode of perception. He doesn't really think, though he would say he did, that things as the enemy sees them are things as they are. If you try to explain to him that men's prayers today are one of the innumerable coordinates with which the enemy harmonizes the weather of tomorrow, he would reply that then the enemy always knew men were going to make those prayers, and if so, they did not pray freely, but were predestined to do so. And he would add that the weather on a given day can be traced back through its causes to the original creation of matter itself, so that the whole thing, both on the human and on the material side, is given from the word go. What he ought to say, of course, is obvious to us that the problem of adapting the particular weather to the particular prayers is merely the appearance at 2 points in his temporal mode of perception of the total problem of adapting the whole spiritual universe to the whole corporeal universe. That creation in its entirety operates at every point of space and time, or rather, that their kind of consciousness forces them to encounter the whole self consistent creative act as a series of successive events. Why that creative act leaves room for their free will is the problem of problems, the secret behind the enemy's nonsense about love. How it does so is no problem at all, for the enemy does not foresee the humans making their free contributions in a future, but sees them doing so in his unbounded now. And obviously, to watch a man doing something is not to make him do it. It may be replied that some meddlesome human writers, notably Boethius, have let this secret out. But in the intellectual climate which we have at last succeeded in producing throughout Western Europe, you needn't bother about that. Only the learned read old books, and we have now so dealt with the learned that they are of all men the least likely to acquire wisdom by doing so. We have done this by inculcating the historical point of view. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that when a learned man is presented with any statement in an ancient author, the one question he never asks is whether it is true. He asks who influenced the ancient writer and how far the statement is consistent with what he said in other books, and what phase in the writer's development or in the general history of thought it illustrates, and how it affected later writers, and how often it has been misunderstood, especially by the learned man's own colleagues, and what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, and what is the present state of the question. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate that what he said could possibly modify your thoughts or your behavior, this would be rejected as unutterably simple minded. And since we cannot deceive the whole human race all the time, it is most important thus to cut every generation off from all others. For where learning makes a free commerce between the ages, there is always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. But, thanks be to our Father and the historical point of view, great scholars are now as little nourished by the past as the most ignorant mechanic who holds that history is bunk. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
Well, Lewis tackles prayer. And prayer is one of those things that we go to when we're in desperate need, and then at the same time, we'll question it. Does it really work? Did God answer my prayer? Did he not answer my prayer? And Lewis gives light to how Screwtape would want to keep us distracted in prayer. And I was thinking of how Lewis is talking about our prayer, and within time, if I prayed, did it happen because I prayed? If I didn't pray, would it still happen anyways? And uh, time always, I always have, I would say, a love-hate relationship with movies that are time traveling and so forth, because I find it such an interesting concept to think about time and eternity and the now, and yet at the same time, I can get so lost in those movies. And so, as I was, reading uh, Lewis's talk on this letter on time and our prayers, what just came to mind was, do I really believe myself uh, as a believer in Christ, and that God is my Father? Do I really believe that my Heavenly Father holds dear to Himself my prayers? And just like an earthly father we want to believe that our Father hears our prayers, that He cares about our needs and our hearts, and and you can see how Screwtape wants to distract from the concreteness that God desires of our prayers, in a sense, the simplicity, and truly asking and believing that He will give me the daily bread of what I need. And He truly desires for me, for us to ask Him, to give Him and ask Him for our needs uh, and for our hearts. And so, I mean, Lewis, he really challenges us uh, to think about prayer, to believe in prayer, and I really liked I really liked the first paragraph where he talks about distracted prayer, and Screwtape wants to distract us by. We would think he wants to distract us by the distraction, and Lewis kind of turns that upside down and says, God actually wants you to give him the distraction when it happens. Maybe that's the real prayer. And how often, through my own willpower, nope, put the distraction out of my head and get back to the prayer. And Lewis, really gave me something to think about, that maybe the distraction is what I need to give him. Um, So yeah, I really, I appreciate uh, this letter on prayer, and how does Screwtape really want to distract us from that? I always say that concreteness, that simplicity uh, of prayer, and talking to God, truly believing that He is our Father.
And that he will respond to our prayer
Mm.
in some way. And we have gotten this notion that the only prayer answer that is evidence that God is listening to us is yes. And that's that could hardly be the case. God, in His ultimate wisdom, is sometimes going to answer yes. He is sometimes going to answer no, and He was sometimes going to answer not now or not yet. And we, as Lewis points out, we don't understand time. We live inside of it, and as such, it has a different reality to us than it does to God. Now, there are all kinds of different ideas about exactly what that means in terms of, well, how does God experience or see time? Truth is, we don't know. The probably dominant view within the church forever has been that God knows everything that has happened, will happen, could happen, etc. That all of those things that He knows every detail of the future, and yet doesn't determine it. And there are others who believe that God somehow knows everything that has transpired and is transpiring, and all of the infinite possibilities that could come, which is a form of what is often called open theism. Truth is, we don't know how God sees time because we can't see it. And so Screwtape wants to distract the patient by getting him bogged down in this, and in this feeling that, well, if I ask for something in petitionary prayer and it doesn't happen, or I don't get it, does that mean that petitionary prayer doesn't work? Well, like I said, yes is not the only answer available to God, just like it's not the only answer available to us. You know, when Jesus gave the description or the analogy, if you ask who as an earthly father, if he's asked for bread, is going to give a snake. Well, the reverse is true too. If we ask for something that's bad for us, or that would in any way harm us, God's got an answer for us, and it could be no, it could be not yet. But Screwtape wants to get us bogged down in this notion that because we don't get everything we ask for, that God is somehow not listening, or that petitionary prayer doesn't work. Of course, this is where he plays that heads I win, tails you lose game. If we do get something that we have asked for, then we wonder, well, would it have happened anyway? Would I have gotten that anyway, even if I hadn't asked God for it? And so there we still get skeptical about, well, does prayer really work? Is it effective? And we the truth is, and he spends the next section talking about this, weaving time into it. We don't understand how God views time. Maybe the things that we have asked for, God has already determined he was going to give us, and he knew in advance. There isn't really an advance for him. Keep in mind that's a human construct because we live in time. Um, he knows that we're asking for it, and it's already in the works that we're going to get it. He knows all of these things, or maybe he doesn't. Maybe he knows all of the infinite possibilities, and us asking for it determines one of those future potentialities that he already knew. Either way, it's important for us to ask. One thing, it humbles us. It reminds us that we're not the ones in charge. We didn't provide this incredible world around us. We don't provide the things that we have. Yes, we may work for them. We may work hard for them. But ultimately, everything we have is a provision of a loving God, and therefore we should be both grateful for it and unashamed to ask for those things that we need. It's one of the reasons, I'm sure, that Jesus included petitionary prayer when he taught his disciples how to pray, and said, give us our daily bread. um, it's not just a physical thing, although it is that as well. Give us the things that we need as a good, loving God, and uh, ask for the things that we want, sure, but know that what we want and what God is going to give to us because it's good for us, not always the same thing.
Well, as you said, uh, that word we can get stuck on, I can get stuck on is, does it work? And
Mm-hmm.
you know, if I think to to myself, back to my parents, my father, and whether I got what I wanted or not, it works. It may not work the way I think it should, but it still works because my father is still my father, and so it works. You know, and what came to mind, the the power and simplicity of all of our prayer is ultimately that God wants us. He wants the sincerity of our hearts and our souls. And I always looked at prayer, our prayer, talking to God, is really to kind of whittle down within us, you know, what do we want? And do we ultimately want Him? Do we want God? And, I think of, do we want that relationship? And that's what Screwtape wants to distract us from. As Lewis says, wants us to distract our prayer to get into intellectual things. Does it actually work or not? And if when I asked my father for something as a child, as I said, if I didn't get it, that relationship is still there. That relationship still works.
Right.
And the essence, I would say, of prayer is the two things of the thief on the cross, the good thief, as we say, or some say. And he did two things. One, he recognized he was a sinner before Christ. And the second thing is he asked what he wanted. Please remember me when you come into your kingdom.
Right.
And so for myself, when my prayer gets too involved, too in the weeds, that's what I have to go to and say, okay, what do I really want? What am I really talking to Tim about? And ultimately, Screwtape, as you said, he wants us to be distracted from what do I really want, and do I really trust that it's going to work, whether it goes my way or not, it still works.
Well, and that what do I want? God so often uses our prayer life to align what we want to what He wants, and what we end up wanting is not always what we started out wanting. As we grow and mature, otherwise, what we've done is we've basically reduced God into being a a supernatural Pez dispenser. If I ask for this, pop pop, I get it, which is very much uh, the notion of many religions out there that if I particularly ancient religions, not so much the modern, but if I sacrifice X, then it will rain, or I will have a good crop, or if I perform such and such a ritual, then this will happen. It's always if X, then God Y, and like I said, it reduces him to some kind of a puppet in the sky that everything we ask for has to happen, or somehow he doesn't exist, or he doesn't love us, or whatever. But uh, understanding things the way we think of a good earthly father is probably as close an analogy as we will get. Like you said, the answer no doesn't mean that the relationship is broken. Um, it just means, and we will wonder, well, excuse me, well, okay, no, why not? It's okay to ask that question. God can handle our questions. He can handle us wondering, well, why am I not being healed of this? Or why is my wife or my mother or my child, in particular, when we talk about physical ailments? Uh, Truth is, we don't understand God's purpose. We don't see the future and how He's going to use everything. Whether sticking with the idea of physical healing, whether He uses a miraculous healing to bring glory to Himself, or whether He uses the unwavering witness of a suffering saint to bring glory to Himself, we don't choose that avenue. He does, and He's always got a reason for it. And the same thing goes with any kind of petitionary prayer that we have. We simply don't know what His design is and what His purpose is. Uh, we can't. I got really good, I think, advice from a pastor, a few decades ago, and that was regarding time and how we view it versus how God views it. And he said most of Orthodox Christianity believes that God knows the what we think of as the past, present, and future, just as all one thing. That He sees all of this together at once. He said, if, however, it's useful for you, live as if He doesn't. Live as if every prayer, every decision you make, is the most important thing that you can do. And what you'll wind up doing is aligning yourself in relationship with God by uh, simply living from our perspective, which is all we can do, because this is how we see time. Live that way, and spend your time in prayer. Spend your time making decisions with your life that matter.
I was before you said Pez dispenser, that's what went through my mind, and yet, you know, God, He wants us to ask Him for things. He wants us to ask for our daily bread. Says it. Jesus says, as you said, says it in the Our Father. And Screwtape is the one that wants us to doubt that and start getting in the weeds of, well, does it really work? And it's really does that. I mean, whether it's the right terminology, that doesn't matter. He wants us to come to him. It's asking him for our daily bread is the process of our being I mean, I'll use the word being transformed into him, getting to know him. And he wants us to ask him for what we think we want and need. And it's in that relationship that we come to know him. And let's not get distracted by uh, does it work or not. It works because he makes it work, and that's there's faith.
Well, and like you said, that's even asking that question, does prayer work, makes it a an expecting response Y string pulling, that, like I said, it makes him a Pez dispenser or just a puppet. If if we say that our evidence that prayer works is that the things we ask for must happen, I, it's a very reductionist thing for us to do, even just to ask the question that way. Um, and it follows this general theme. Again, we have a new instance that Lewis brings us of Screwtape using distraction. Keep us distracted from what's true. He comes back to this using the example of the scholarly, the learned man. The one question that they never want to be asked is X true? No, they want, is it consistent with some other belief that I have? Is it consistent with something else that that person has said? And all of these other academic questions, but stay away, stay distracted from asking, is it true? Because if it's true, then everything else falls. Every other objection is irrelevant if something is true. That's just the nature of truth. But distraction again, keep us distracted from the truth about prayer and time. Um, Keep us distracted from anything that could potentially draw us closer to God, the enemy of Screwtape and Wormwood. Well, folks, I hope that this enables you to not be distracted and to draw closer to our Creator. And while we're anticipating our next episode, light something you like. I'm going to get relit. Enjoy this next week.